For those of you unfamiliar, 2001: A Space Odyssey is a 1968 film by Stanley Kubrick about a group of astronauts who try to find the origins of a black monolith that mysteriously appears on the surface of the moon. The scene I'm going to break down is a little past the halfway point of the film, at the hour and 20-minute mark. Right before this scene, we learn that the ship's AI, HAL 9000, may be malfunctioning.
We should advise you, however, that our preliminary findings indicate that your onboard 90000 computer is in error predicting the fault. I say again, in error predicting the fault. I know this sounds rather incredible, but this conclusion is based on the results from our twin 90000 computer. We are skeptical ourselves, and we are running cross-checking routines to determine reliability of this conclusion. Sorry about this little snag, fellas, and we'll get this info to you just as soon as we work it out. X-Ray Delta 1, this is Mission Control. 2049er, transmission concluded.
So in this scene, the two crew members find a private place to discuss how they should move forward on their mission. This scene follows a continuity-style editing, and each shot is connected to the one before it. All the shots are fairly claustrophobic in feeling. If it's not a close-up, then the astronauts are framed by objects that keep them trapped in the middle of the screen. This emphasizes how they are trapped on the ship with a malfunctioning AI. The first shot of the scene is a 24-second pan, where the crew members climb down a ladder into the escape pod room. This is used to establish the change in location. However, once they are in the room, Kubrick breaks one of the rules of cinema, the 180-degree rule. He cuts across the 180-degree line to the other side, creating an uneasiness because we have suddenly switched locations on the spatial plane. This cut is made to hint that there's something off, or that something bad is going to happen. They try to guise their true intentions by talking about looking at a problem with the pod, so that they don't raise suspicions with HAL. The shot cuts from being from the side of the astronauts to the front of the astronauts to show HAL's physical presence within the room. Showing HAL also allows us to start piecing together that maybe the astronauts aren't trying to fix something, but are actually trying to find a space on the ship where HAL can't hear them. Then it cuts behind the astronauts as they climb into the pod. This shot lasts for 8 seconds and cuts before both the astronauts climb into the pod. The shot doesn't cut to the inside of the pod, but instead cuts to a close-up of HAL. At this point, we realize that we are not grouped with the astronauts, but we are actually like HAL, watching as they discuss his fate. The contrast between the wide shot and the close-up really closes into HAL's watchful eye. This sudden close-up also adds to the uneasy tone of the scene, with this unblinking red dot staring us down. The next cut is a match cut with shapes. The roundness of HAL matches the roundness of the pod. The cut is shown as HAL's perspective, as the only other two active members of the spaceship physically shut themselves off from him. When we read left to right, so when an action on the screen like the door closing goes from right to left, it feels off and represents that something is wrong. We cut to HAL because the astronauts ask him to turn the pod around. In the corner we see the pod turn, so we know that HAL can still hear them. These shots represent a match on action as we see the pod rotating from a different angle. From this angle, we can actually see the astronauts in the pod, and so can HAL. This is our first time in the pod. This cut to the close-up on the communication switches finally answers our questions of why they are talking in the pod. It is the only place in the ship where they can turn HAL off. This shot lasts 6 seconds. The astronauts waste no time in turning off the communications. This cut is also a match on action as the one astronaut pulls his hand away from turning off the switches. This shot is the longest one, lasting 1 minute and 51 seconds. The astronauts start by asking HAL to rotate the pod. After about 15 seconds of asking, they determine that they are in a safe place to talk. The whole time they talk about what to do with HAL, we are not so much looking at the astronauts as we are looking at HAL in the distance as they determine his fate. We cut to a medium close-up of HAL on the outside of the pod. Cutting to this medium close-up emphasizes that he is the subject of the discussion. He is the thing we should be focused on. Then we cut back again to the astronauts as they continue their discussion. We cut to another close-up of HAL to the same effect as the one before. We can feel him watching. And then we cut to his perspective, and we realize he is watching. He's watching the astronauts and reading their lips. These next 4 shots are actually one shot where the camera whips back and forth, but I broke it up to make it easier to dissect them. The first shot lasts 4 seconds. Then it whips to the second shot that lasts 5 seconds. It whips back to the first astronaut, but only lasts 3 seconds this time. And when it whips to the other astronaut, it only lasts 4 seconds instead of 5. The slight increase in speed as Hal whips back and forth reading their lips helps add to his distress as he learns that the astronauts want to turn him off. Then it cuts to black.